Tutankhamun, Pharaoh of Egypt, died and was buried 3,300 years ago. Exactly 50 years ago, his body was discovered in his unplundered tomb. And now, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of this, the greatest archaeological discovery of all time, 50 of the treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb have been brought to Britain. BOAC and the RAF between them mounted a classic cloak and dagger operation to fly the exhibits secretly to London. The M4 motorway from Heathrow Airport into London was closed to all other traffic. Maximum security precautions were taken. All bridges were kept clear by police. And so the heavily guarded convoy sped into central London, and at 1 o'clock in the morning it arrived at the British Museum. Some weeks went by before it was announced that the treasures of Tutankhamun had in fact arrived. For Dr. Ethan Edwards, keeper of Egyptology, this was a moment almost as nerve-wracking as the first moment of discovery 50 years ago. For the Egyptian experts who had travelled with the treasures, and for Ian Pearson, who was in charge of the packing and transportation, it was a culmination of many months of planning and skilled work. The press and television were invited to witness the unpacking of the most spectacular of all the treasures. It was a golden face mask of Tutankhamun himself, one of the greatest works of art of the ancient world.
And in the various stages as we go, we unpack.
For the visitors at the British Museum this summer, it will be the prize piece in what could well turn out to be the greatest exhibition of the century. Treasures of Tutankhamun, and the gold and bronze trumpet found in Tutankhamun's tomb welcomes us to this marvelous exhibition. Tonight, Chronicle is privileged to invite you inside the British Museum for an exclusive view of an exhibition that people are queuing up to see at the rate of over 32,000 a week. Tutankhamun has been in the headlines ever since the sensational news of the discovery of a virtually unplundered tomb in Egypt broke on an astonished world. It was announced in an exclusive story in the London Times of November the 30th, 1922. An Egyptian treasure, great find at Thebes, by runner to Luxor. But even the London Times, which along with the Sunday Times is jointly sponsoring this exhibition with the trustees of the British Museum, even they didn't know then just how great a find it was. The archaeologists at that time were just on the threshold of discovery, and it wasn't for several months before the full extent of the treasures was revealed. Well, tonight, here in the British Museum, we too are on the threshold of discovery. The exhibition takes us into the heart of ancient Egypt, the Valley of the Kings at Thebes. For it was here that the British archaeologist Howard Carter searched for the lost tomb of Tutankhamun for several seasons on behalf of Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy sportsman and patron of the arts who'd gone to Egypt to convalesce after a motoring accident and developed there an interest in Egyptology. They became familiar figures in the Valley of the Kings as they drove to their excavation sites for 6 fruitless seasons. Success came in November 1922, when Carter's workmen came across the top of a flight of steps hewn into the rock. It turned out to be the entrance to a tomb. It had been buried under the debris and huts of the builders of a later tomb, and so there was a chance that it had not been plundered. At the bottom of the steps, a plastered door with the seals of the necropolis guards apparently intact. Behind this door was another passage, and beyond that, when Carter made a hole through a second door, he caught a glimpse of wonderful things, a fantastic jumbled treasury of furniture and works of art, and everywhere the gleam of gold. It turned out that robbers had managed to burrow into the tomb just after the burial and ransacked it. But they'd been disturbed in time, and the tomb was virtually intact. The excitement was enormous. People flocked to the Valley of the Kings from all over the world, emperors and scholars and tourists. The Times newspaper had the exclusive contract for the coverage of the story as it developed day by day, and they really went to town on it. But even more sensational revelations were to come. For in one wall of this antechamber of wonderful things was a doorway plastered up and sealed. On either side, 2 statues of Tutankhamun himself stood sentinel. And when the antechamber had been cleared, it was time to break down this door. A privileged few were allowed to attend. One of them was Alan Gardner, the leading Egyptologist of his day. Gardner described the occasion in a letter that he wrote to his wife on February the 17th, 1923. The scene was a little theatrical. First, Carter got up and said a few words. He was terribly excited, and there was a quiver in his voice. Perhaps, he said, in a few minutes we are going to find Tutankhamun buried in all his glory. Then he set to work with crowbar and chisel to cut away the plaster. It was quite half an hour, full of tense excitement, before a hole large enough was made to reveal anything of the content of the chambers. Then Carter took an electric torch and threw in a ray of light. "I see a great golden shrine," he said. Well, as it happened, there was not one shrine but 4, fitting one inside the other like Chinese boxes. And inside, the coffin of Tutankhamun. Again, not one but 4, one inside the other. And inside the 4th one, the mummified body of the king. As the bandages were cut away, dozens of personal ornaments and possessions came to light, until finally all that remained of Tutankhamun, boy king of Egypt 3,300 years after his death, was this. And so the king had been found. But what had he been like in life, this relatively insignificant pharaoh who had died about the age of 18? Well, his tomb was a sort of lumber room of his life. And as Howard Carter methodically sorted his way through all the material, a picture began to emerge of the king whose statues had guarded his own mortal remains. Today, his wooden statue still stands sentinel at this exhibition. He's precisely as large as life. He was 5 foot 6 inches tall, judging by his mummified remains. His face and body are coated with black resin to symbolize regeneration, like the dark soil of Egypt herself. The royal headcloth and the collar are covered with gold leaf. And so are the pleated kilt and the odd jutting apron that he wears. In one hand, he carries a ceremonial mace, and in the other, his left hand, a long staff. Tutankhamun. He was so very young when he died, just a snub-nosed boy with sticking-out ears. But from the jumbled contents of his tomb, we can trace an outline at least of his brief life from the cradle to the grave. And when he was just out of the cradle, this child's chair was made for him with a little footstool to go with it. There's no inscription on it, but why else should the priest in charge of the funeral have put it into that antechamber of wonderful things, if it hadn't been a favored memento of the king's childhood? It's made of ebony imported from tropical Africa, inlaid with ivory ornamentation. The lion's paw legs, for instance, have ivory claws. And the sides have decorated panels in gilt, like this ibex on its knees. The footstool had been much repaired, with patches of new wood on the front, back, and sides. It's a charmingly intimate object to find in a tomb, but not a particularly princely chair, one would think, for a child who became pharaoh at the age of only 9.